Oliver Twist. Part 3, Chapters 35-39. Chapter 35, Nancy is murdered. Chapter 35. It was nearly 2 hours before daybreak. Fagin was sitting in his den. His eyes were red with fury and anger. He was waiting for Sikes. Few minutes later Sikes arrived. Fagin told him that he wanted him to tell something. Noah Claypole was sleeping on the mattress. Fagin waked him up and told him to narrate the chat between Nancy and Mr. Brownlow. He narrated the talk between them. Sikes was very angry, and on hearing this he was in a great rage, and went straight to Nancy's house. He decided to shoot her, but he hit her twice with the butt of the gun and murdered her while she begged for mercy. Chapter 36. Mr. Brownlow meets monks. Chapter 36. Mr. Brownlow gets out of a coach followed by two other men who carried a third man. It was Monks. Monks was afraid to enter the house, but he was forced to. Once they were alone in the Brownlow's house, Monks complained about his ill treatment at the hands of his father's old friend. Mr. Brownlow calls him with his real name, Edward Leaford. The author continued that Mr. Leaford was forced by his family to marriage to an old, wealthy but an awful woman. Monks was the only son. His parents hated each other and eventually departed/separated but didn't divorced. Monks and his mother went to Europe. Mr. Leaford stayed in London and fell in love with Agnes Fleming. But they didn't marry. Mr. Leaford went to Rome to deal with the will. Monk's mother was in Paris and travelled to Rome to meet Mr. Leaford. Mr. Leaford died the day after they met. Mr. Brownlow said that before leaving for Rome, Edwin gave him a portrait of Agnes Fleming. After he died, Mr. Brownlow searched for Agnes, but there was no positive result. Then Mr. Brownlow said that he has rescued his younger brother. At the moment, Monks denied that he doesn't have a brother. Brownlow was unimpressed by his denial, but still Monks refuses everything. He says that a resemblance between some orphan boy and a dead man's painting of Agnes Fleming doesn't prove anything, that a baby, Oliver, was ever born. Brownlow accepts that it doesn't prove that, but his words with Fagin were heard by Nancy. Monks was terrified and decided to tell the whole story. Just then Mr. Losborne bursts in and tells them that the robber, Sikes, would be arrested tonight. They locked Monks in a room and went out. Chapter 37. Sikes is killed. Chapter 37. The chapter opens with a description of a dodgy neighbourhood on the banks of Thames. The houses are all in a rough shape. Toby Crackit, Tom Chitterling and Cags are sitting in one of the upper-story house. Toby asks them that when was Fagin arrested, and the reply was around 2 p.m. Charlie was able to hide, but Bolter was arrested. Chitterling described that how bloodthirsty the mob was when Fagin was arrested. Just then Sikes arrived there. He looked like hell. Sikes asked if it's true that Fagin was arrested. The reply was in positive. No one wanted to talk with him. Later Charlie Bates came there and was terrified of Sikes. He calls him a monster and attacked him. They were fighting that there was a knock on the door. The public wanted to arrest him. Charlie calls for help. Sikes threw him in a room and locked him. Sikes asks for a rope so he can lower himself in the ditch and run off to security. Sikes climbs on the roof. The water was out, so the ditch was just mud. Sikes was afraid and then ties one end of the rope to the chimney and ties a rope on the other end and put the rope under his arm. Suddenly he slipped and the rope catches around his neck and he hanged himself. The dog had climbed on the roof and sees him fall, jumps after him but falls in the mud, dead. Chapter 38. The History of Oliver Twist. Chapter 38. 2 days later, Oliver, Mrs. Maylie, Rose, Mrs. Bedwin, Mr. Losburn are travelling to Oliver's native town. Mr. Brownlow decided not to tell Rose and Oliver. Everything in the town is very much as Oliver remembered it. They arrive at the hotel, and Mr. Grimwig is there to meet them. All the men, and occasionally Mrs. Maylie, as well, are bustling around looking anxious and dealing with business, and Rose and Oliver are kept in the dark. Finally, the men all enter the room where Oliver and Rose have been waiting, and bring with them the man who had appeared at Oliver's window with Fagin, Monks. Monks looks hatefully at Oliver. They introduce Oliver to Monks as his half-brother / Monks tells the story of what happened when he and his mother arrived in Rome to meet his dying father. He and his mother found 2 papers on his desk that were supposed to have been forwarded to Mr. Brownlow. One was a letter, and the other was his will. The letter was addressed to Agnes, begging her forgiveness, and asking her to take care of the child and not to blame the innocent baby for any of its father's sins. The will described how evil his first wife was, and how wicked and malicious his first son, Monks, was, and how he wanted his property to be divided into 2 portions, the first to go to Agnes Fleming, and the second portion to go to their as yet unborn child, but only if he reached adulthood without having committed any public act of dishonor. If the child did commit any such act, then that portion of his estate would go to Monks, because the 2 children would then be equal. Monks's mother had burnt the will. So Agnes's father had run away from his village in shame with his other daughter, and had even changed his name. Agnes herself, meanwhile, had already run away. Some years later, Monks's mother had gone to Mr. Brownlow. She told him that Monks had run away from her when he was 18 years old, and had robbed her of jewels and money on his way out. She had an incurable disease, and wanted to see him before she died. Brownlow helped her, and they did find Monks, and he went back with his mother to France. Monks continues the story from there. His mother died, but before Monks swore to his mother on her deathbed that he would hunt down that child, drag it into crime, and see it hanged. Fagin was an old acquaintance of Monks, and had received a large reward for corrupting Oliver, but had to give up a portion of it if Oliver were ever rescued. Monks is able to pick up the story again at this point. He bought the locket and the ring from the man and woman he had told them about before, who had stolen them from old Sally, who had stolen them from Agnes's dead body. Mr. Grimwig takes this signal to bring in the Bumbles. Mr. Bumble comes in full of fake enthusiasm at seeing Oliver again. They tell him to shut it, and ask him to identify Mr. Monks. The Bumbles pretend never to have seen him before, and deny any knowledge of the locket or the ring, but later accepts it. Mr. Brownlow tells Rose that there's one more piece to the story, and that it involves her. Monks picks up the story of the Fleming family again. After the father died in Wales of a broken heart, his younger daughter was left there under a fake name, amongst strangers, without any evidence of where she'd come from. The cottagers in the village raised her for a while. Monks's mother went and found the child there. Rather than take it away with her, she decided to just leave it, figuring that the cottagers were poor enough that they'd grow to hate the child as a financial burden. She also told them a bunch of lies about the little girl's family, that she was illegitimate, and of a bad family, and sure to go wrong at some point. But a kindly old widow lady saw the little girl by chance, and decided to take her in and raise her herself. Of course, that little girl was Rose, and Monks identifies her. Mrs. Maylie and Rose hug each other and cry a little bit. So Rose is really Oliver's aunt, the baby sister of Agnes, Oliver's mother. They hug each other and cry some more. The other folks all leave. Someone knocks on the door. It's Harry Maylie. Harry proposed and she accepted. Chapter 39. The Happy Ending. Chapter 39. 3 months later, Rose and Harry are married at the church where Harry's going to be the new clergyman. Mrs. Maylie moves in with them, and they're all very happy together. They divide the money in half, but it's only about £3,000 each. Monks disappears with his half of the money to some distant part of America, squanders it, falls back on his old wicked ways, and eventually dies of some complication from his disease in prison. All the surviving members of Faggin's gang also die far from home. They were transported from England. Mr. Brownlow legally adopts Oliver as his own son. After all, Oliver was the son of his oldest friend. The two of them, and Mrs. Bedwin, moved to a house only about a mile from the Maylies' new house, so they all form an idyllic, happy little community. Mr. Losberne decides that Chertsey isn't such a great village anymore, now that the Maylies have left, so he gets a little cottage near theirs, and moves as well. Mr. Losberne develops a taste for gardening, and fishing, and carpentry, and various other hobbies. Mr. Grimwig and Mr. Losberne have become great friends, so Mr. Grimwig visits several times a year, and always criticizes the sermon to Harry's face, even if he thought it was good. Noah Claypole is pardoned for his share in all of the crimes of Faggin's gang because he was a witness against them. He decides that being a paid informer is a pretty good gig, so he goes into that full time. Mr. and Mrs. Bumble are fired from the workhouse and become so poor that they eventually have to enter the same workhouse as paupers. Mr. Giles and Brittles move with the Maylies to the new house and divide their time between Mr. Brownlow's house and the Maylies. Charlie Bates decides to give up crime and becomes a farmhand in the north of England. The narrator gives a brief sketch of how happy they all are together, and how Rose and Harry have lots of little babies, and how Mr. Brownlow loved Oliver as his own son. The chapter ends with a description of the tablet on the wall in the church with the name Agnes on it, in memory of Oliver's mother and Rose's sister.